This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Good morning and welcome to the November 6th edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I'm Brian Schrader, joined by co-host Ben Jacob and by fellow agronomist Brian Early from the northern part of Indiana. Good morning, guys.
Good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
Well, guys, I think really for the most part, I would say harvest is all but done. Maybe in my part of the world, a little bit of June planted corn, and a little bit further north, I know we've got some June planted corn that still needs to be shelled. As I drive through the countryside, even tillage is wrapping up. A few fertilizer buggies running yesterday afternoon, I think, trying to get in before it rained very much this week. I guess I'd be curious, Ben, Brian, what's status of things look like in your part of the world? Brian, let's start with you.
We are, for the most part, wrapped up. The closer you get to the Michigan state line, the more corn is out. That's not at all abnormal for any year. There's a lot more corn there to begin with, so they always tend to lag behind, and you don't get quite the growing season. But fortunately, everything's standing good, and yields are good, and elevator lines aren't really terrible as of now. So everything, a lot of guys will be wrapped up the end of this week or next week if we don't get a lot of rain, which we are so dry, it would take an immense amount of rain to even put us in that situation. So I don't see anything hold northern Indiana, extreme northern Indiana from wrapping up.
Okay. Ben, how about you? What thing looks like down south?
Yeah, we're for all intents and purposes, we're wrapped up with harvest. There's 50 acres of corn standing across the road from my house, and that's really a function of that grower making the correct decision to not work on Sundays. So he's moving a little slower than some folks do, but that's not anything new to this year. But get that out, I think we'll be pretty well wrapped up across the area. Like Brian mentioned, we are extraordinarily dry. We had maybe 3/10 last week and maybe a half inch in some areas, but 3/10 at my house. And the out in the yard this weekend with the kids, there's still 1.5 inch wide cracks and sod, so it's been very dry, continues to stay very dry. A lot of tillage work has been done, and it's been very hard on tillage equipment with how hard and dry the soil have been. But we don't always get we don't always get a good fall to do some tillage work or some deep ripping or whatever that might be. There's not really been enough moisture to have any weed pressure here late in the season. So overall we're still sitting pretty good. It would be nice to replenish the soil moisture though, for sure.
Yeah, to that point, when you pull up the Indiana Drought Monitor for the end of October and you look at it, what you'll see is actually in Bryan, your part of the world, kind of from a line Lafayette over to Muncie, is the severe drought designation, so D2 on the Drought Monitor. There's a wedge kind of in my area as I move south, kind of that Muncie, Lafayette south, all the way down Ben, Greene County, and then it kind of shoots back up a little bit toward Randolph County. That's the moderately drought-stressed part of the world, so D1, and then further south all the way to the river, that's the abnormally dry, so D0 rating. So the entire state has some level of drought at this point of some varying degree. And so we definitely need some rain. I haven't looked at the forecast for the winter to see what moisture looks like from snow. But boy, if we don't have much of a winter, we could start out the spring of 2025 very much like we did the spring of 2023 with very little groundwater at all. And that can we'll circle back to that probably closer to spring if that persists. But there's a lot of problems that can come about with that.
See, Brian, you scared me for a second there. I thought you were going to say this is very similar to how 2012 stacked up with the 2011 growing season going the way that it did.
Yeah. No, but that's a good question to look at. I'll have to do a little investigation, see where we're at compared to where we ended up the year in 2012. That's a good call out, Ben. I hadn't even thought about that.
Well, don't spend time on X because it'll make you concerned about next year.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, Ben, the reason we've got Brian on today, obviously, throughout the course of the summer on podcasts, you and I were very vocal about much of the tar spot pressure that we had and just how significantly different it had been in 2024 compared to what we had seen. But we had also referenced a number of times our colleagues to the north in Indiana and Illinois into Wisconsin Michigan, that had dealt with tar spot for a number of years. And we've asked Brian to join us today because Brian has been one of those folks. He was really at ground zero for the start of it. Brian probably knows, and our colleague Lance Shepard, they probably know as much about tar spot in the field as anybody we work with. And I say that unfortunately, Brian, I know it's not been a lot of fun, but we wanted to have you on today because your experience with tar spot in 2024 was very different than what Ben and I saw. So maybe just let's start out with give us kind of the idea or a perspective on what tar spot looked like for your geography. You might define that a little bit so that we can kind of do the compare contrast game here and ask you a handful of questions about what our growers and those growers that are seeing tar spot for the first time in 24 should expect in 25.
Yeah. So the geography I would cover would be, if you can picture Kokomo to Lafayette, Highway 26. So if you drew a line straight north from Lafayette and a line straight north from Kokomo up 421 and 31, that's my rectangle clear to the Michigan line. So that has always been I would say between Lance and I, it's a toss-up who has the heaviest tar spots. So 15 was the first year it was found, and we saw a little bit until 18 was the year it really blew up on us. So it went from something that we saw to something that was a big problem in 18. So if you look back over until 2024, it has been predominantly heavier in the northern 2/3 of my area. So that would be north of the Wabash River, where the soils are sandier, you get lake effect, we get more clouds, and I've got the irrigation belt up there. So under irrigation, it's always been a heavier disease for us. So the difference in 2024 was it was reversed for me. So the area to the south, the nice productive heavy soil, a third I've got south of the Wabash River, that is where tar spot was heavy for me, which it's been there in years past, but it has never taken front stage and really taken off and really hit the crop like it usually does in northern Indiana. So I saw the reverse, where that area was really pummeled with tar spot, and it wasn't even the entire area to the south. It was more patchy this year, I would say, than it's been in years past, but it ended up getting everybody. It got heavy everywhere, even closer to Michigan. It took a lot longer to get there, and the yield damage isn't as severe. But it was really eye-opening to me this year that it came in so late and we were so dry at the time, and we're seeing the kind of response to fungicide that we're seeing this year. So I've heard from you guys, you're seeing 40 and 50 bushel. We've never had that. 20 to 30 was probably the most I saw in years past. This year I have 40s too. And double sprays, we have some people messing with drones doing some strip trials on dent corn when normally we would not spray corn that late, and still picking up 15 from a second application. It behaved a lot differently this year than I had seen in years past. So it was a backwards year for me on tar spot. Our guys to the north always expect it to show up and pummel the crop. And it really didn't. It's the response closer to Michigan is more 15 to 20. That's historically kind of what we've seen. So I'd say it was a normal year for that. The one thing that you look back that it always happens for us is it always shows up. It may be really late, but ever since we've had it bad, it shows up in one form or another in some level every year.
Well, Brian, we talked a lot on the podcast about leaf wetness, time of leaf wetness. And given the fact that you were so dry, even late, can you help us kind of unpack what you think went on, even in those areas where it was dry, that you ended up with it so late, knowing that, humidity for the most part was, I'd say, average, even maybe slightly below? Do you have a theory on why you feel like in those dry areas you still saw tar spot, even though maybe it was late, but it did show up?
Yeah, so it's actually, I think the dryness is a component. Late last year in the winter, there was a study released that I believe 5 or 6 land-grant universities went together on trying to model tar spot. And so their findings was periods of wetness followed by extended periods of dryness is what really got tar spot moving. So if you looked at my area last year, where Burrow came through. It kind of came right through the middle, and to the north we got a lot of rain. So the tar spot definitely lagged where we had consistent moisture. We had moisture every day until August, basically. So you didn't see tar spot develop where we just had rain after rain, or when we didn't have rain, we irrigated because you have to on the sand. So I did see firsthand where constant moisture actually didn't drive the infections like you'd think with a disease, that you needed that period of a dry stretch to really set it off. And that's exactly what I had in the third, where I would border up closer to you guys, where it was more of a, I would say, a normal growing season where you just weren't saturated the entire time.
Okay. Now, you've said that you expect it every year. I know that we've had some different studies. We've seen some observations that suggest that maybe there's some kind of, I hate to use the word cycle, but there's this 3-year development process. Based on your experience, do you see that? Do you feel like this is a disease that's surging every third year? And do you think that's related to, population dynamics, or has that just been coincidental because of the environments that we've had?
Yeah, I purely think that's coincidental. We've had it every year, and it's been heavy every year too. It's just how soon it gets cranking and where you're at in the reproductive cycle when it hits. One thing with tar spot is it's hard. To me, you can't scout for it because it's never present to the eye when you scout. So it's a disease that does everything later in the reproductive cycle. So if I go out and scout, just like a lot of us did this year, we will see maybe no spots this year in my geography. Most of the time you go out and scout, you would not have sprayed for tar spot doing the scout method because it wasn't there. Those infections were probably dormant at the point we couldn't see them, but then it takes off and goes. So when we scout and make decisions, we miss it a lot of the time. So I don't think it's cyclic like that, because I've had heavy levels every single year. So 21 was a terrible year, 18 was a terrible year. We expected this year to be terrible. It was terrible for you guys, but it didn't hit us just because our weather conditions. Like I said, that heavy rain belt really held it off. It was amazing to see that firsthand after looking at that study that they did. It was certainly true.
Yeah, Ben, Brian's comment here about the scouting piece of this. I know that you and I, as we get, headed into the winter and into meeting season, there's going to be a lot of discussions about how do I plan for this? How do I figure out fungicide applications, all those things. I'd be curious, maybe a little bit early in your formulation process here, but what's the advice that you're going to give to these guys that this is the first year it was, epidemic in proportion? How are you going to talk your growers through that as we start to plan for 25?
Yeah, sure. So let's go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think, Brian, that down here anyway, based on the observations that we've had, and we've had it before, never this early. It's always come in late. There's been a definite impact on standability in the past, but never anything like this. And like Brian mentioned, it was not uniform across the area. There were pockets that were much heavier than others, but I really think, based on my observations and everything I've read about it, that the thing we need to look for first is the weather, and maybe the dry period after. But I'd be curious to get Brian's feedback on this. But I think if we string together really at any point in the growing season, a year ago I would have told you that the corn needs to canopy first, but this year it was earlier than that. If we string together a few days of rain and overcast to maintain leaf moisture. I mean, we had a couple of different periods where we probably had constant leaf moisture for 72 hours, maybe a little bit longer. And I think that's really what set this all in motion. And we did have the dry period after that Brian talked about, so I think that's key, right? Do we have enough moisture initially to get it started early? So how much moisture do we have? When do we have it? And Brian made another point that I think is key, is that black spot that you see, the identifiable part of it when you're scouting, is at the end of the life cycle. It's already released spores. So, I think this year where guys were disappointed in their fungicide response, or didn't find a fungicide spot response, the timing was just off. We had a lot of, it was interesting to hear Brian's response up there to dent corn, because we did not see that down here. We saw we saw that was basically setting money on fire, spraying that late. And there were a lot of people that tried it just because they got behind it. And, visually still, it's a really hard disease to scout for. It's not what we're trained to do. That black spot's not what our eyes used to looking for. So, but I do think you can, to some degree, scout for it, at least to know it's present. But I think that for me, it really starts with paying attention to the weather. And then I think when I dig into this a little bit more, I know already there is a definite planting date correlation this year that will match back up with the weather pattern that we had, I'm sure. But I think that you can kind of predict, or at least get an idea of how heavy the pressure is going to be if you do focus on the weather a little bit.
Yeah. Brian, help us, guys, maybe that this was their first year with Tar Spot. They're on the ledge, if you will. Man, I just can't imagine having to do 2 applications. I know I need to spray fungicide, but the timing's so important. Kind of talk us through, from an experience standpoint, having, going all the way back to 2018, 2019, from your experience, how do we manage this for the uninitiated? This is our first time through. What do we need to think about? Is Ben's idea of let's watch the weather and then make a decision the right approach, or how do we work with folks that have only had 1 year of experience and it's 40, 50 bushel losses? How do we manage that moving forward with some realistic expectation?
One thing I can share is since we have a lot more experience dealing with it time wise, we've got a pretty good handle on responses and timings. And right off the bat, I'll share that we've done a lot of double timing things. Normally, the first application versus an untreated trip or part of a field you leave, we'll pick up 15 to 20. That second one, we've done it a lot of different timings and times. It's very hard to pick up 10. So you look at the economics we're in now, that second application, not only is you don't pick up a lot of yield, but it's definitely not economical as well with the cost of fungicide and application. So right off the bat, I would say try to not plan on doing 2 applications, because experiences showed us it's really hard for that to come off unless you get an epidemic year when it was just off the charts bad like this year. Now, under irrigation for us, we do a lot of 2 applications, but we've also moved to there's a fungicide at planting that helps slow it down. And a lot of the guys in the irrigated belt will do that, and then 1 pass late. So I would say 1 pass for almost every situation is the ticket. Timing, I think, is one thing where you really need to change your management. So we have pushed fungicide applications later since we've had tar spots. So everything used to be done at brown silking, a little at silking. We've pushed almost everything back to blister stage. So we'll go the entire blister stage. So the first part of when the blister stage starts, when your kernels start to swell up and they're clear till they get yellow. That's kind of our sweet spot where we've been trying to hit that single application. And you look at Purdue's data, particularly up at the Penny station that's just outside Valparaiso. They've done a lot of work with tar spot up there, because that's kind of ground zero for horribleness for it. So they always have the pressure. And the fungicide studies on timing there will definitely show that blister stage is kind of the sweet spot. Now, you can go 2 weeks before, a week before, a week after, and there's a little yield difference. Both, that's still all responsive, but that's kind of the mark to hit right now. So basically, what you guys are probably used to dealing with on fungicide, you're talking about going a couple weeks later. Sorry.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. And I think that kind of jives with my experience. I think based on seeing things this year, Ben, you're absolutely right. Planting date, at least in my geography, there's a clear connection or relationship between planting date and when we saw it. And I think I haven't dug into the rain data, but I'm almost sure, just even thinking through the season, that it's going to correlate to just exactly what Brian said, that this is all going to be related to both rainfall and the timing of when it came and then drying off. So that makes sense. So I guess anything else on tar spot before maybe we change and go to a different kind of disease?
Ben, I'm curious, what was your planting date you thought was more more responsive. Mine was April and the first week of May. It was, but then I know my later planted corn ran out of water because we were so dry. So I think the tar spot devastation would have been worse in the later planted corn, but I think drought beat it to the punch.
Yeah. So as I look at it, I mean, I should start. We started planting corn in southern Indiana in March, and we planted corn, as long as your crop insurance guy isn't listening, through June 15th in some areas as well. So, and it certainly was the early planted corn. Now, how much of that is the drought, the way it wrapped up? We had some late planted corn that was much better than I ever thought it would be. I mean, we had some June planted corn, 230, 250 in some areas. It was, that finished out, I mean, just mind-blowingly well, considering that it essentially didn't have a rain since it pollinated, to finish out the season. But the worst areas would have been basically everything planted, I'm going to say before Mother's Day, as to draw a line. If it was planted before Mother's Day, the tar spot was much heavier in that. And I think that, or at least out of the ground by Mother's Day. And I think that you go back and you look at the weather that we had in May and how early we found it. I think that makes sense. Well, really the weather we had going all the way back through April. I mean, we'd have 3 days of rain, 3 days of dry, 3 days of rain, 3 days of dry pretty consistently. And so once we got outside of that window, the late May 25th and later, it was a pretty normal year for it. We found some, at harvest. But I really thought that it's a little bit confusing to me, I guess, because I would have thought with as much moisture as we had in July, that it really would have moved in that corn too. And you know that there's spores around, but I did want to circle back to Brian's comment about fungicides and how many applications and everything that makes sense. I'm gonna burn some capital that I hope I've burned up over time by not making this too salesy, Brian. But there is a definite genetic difference, and in my opinion, the Pioneer products, at least that we sell in southern Indiana, when it comes to tar spot management, already have a fungicide pass in the bag. That doesn't mean that they don't need sprayed, but it means that in situations this year where we had heavy tar spot, you can spray our products pretty much across the board once and get the same result, or a better result even, than spraying some of the competitive products 2 or even 3 times, as was the case in some areas down here. So I do want to call that out. Not trying to push sales on anybody that's here for agronomic information, but that is real. That's very, very real. And I believe that management starts with genetics in many cases. But
it's interesting you say that, Ben, because we, even with double sprays in the past when we've done them, if you have a field split between a good hybrid and a weak hybrid, that you'll still see 5 bushel difference, even with tar spot held off well from 2 fungicide applications. That genetic portion of it never goes away, no matter how good a job you do managing with fungicide. So that still makes a difference.
Yeah. And some of the visuals that we have in those situations, Brian, that you describe, where we've got hybrid separation, just the aerial photographs that we've got, from our field agronomists are fascinating. Just the visual differences, let alone the yield. I mean, it's no wonder, there's a yield correlation there. You can just look at them from the air and see such a significant difference. Well, Ben, you mentioned July moisture, and the last thing I want to visit with Brian is around white mold on soybeans, another disease. I've had quite a bit the last handful of years, the last 2 or 3. We've talked a fair amount about them on the podcast. Brian, you've always had a lot of white mold, partially you mentioned because of your irrigation. I'd be curious, give us kind of the rundown on what 2024 looked like for white mold for you.
It was surprisingly heavy again. Last year was off the charts heavy. This year we did have a lot of rain, and but then it dried off. We had such distinctive rain and then dryness. You get thinking in your mind, well, it's dried up. White mold's not going to show up, and it's kind of like tar spot. It takes a long time for it to show its face, but then when it does, it starts doing its damage. So we did see white mold show up. It was mostly in the fields where we always have heavy. It wasn't at all surprising, but it just showed There's places that it's just every year for us, it's heavy. We can't get around it. And that's part of the reason why corn, you just see so much corn after corn in northern Indiana. Between our environment and the constant moisture because of the lake and because of irrigation, it's just something we always have to deal with. But we're left with the frustrating part about how to deal with it. So with tar spot, I think we got pretty good answers. We got a pretty good handle on how to manage it. With white mold, I definitely don't feel that way. We can put Band-Aids on it and keep the yield loss down some, but it's by far the most devastating soybean disease we have, and I don't feel we have great answers to it. The fungicides help. Some of the other management things we do helps, but you can't get away from the carnage. So I could never fault anybody when they just want to go corn, because it's so, you get tired of raising 35 bushel beans because white mold hit them so bad, or 250 bushel corn under a pivot.
Yep.
So it is what it is.
Pretty easy decision there, really, when you look at the economics of it. Brian, I know fungicide applications for white mold have become increasingly popular. You've got a fair amount of experience with a number of these fungicides. You mentioned that it's just a matter of managing it. And then I think the other piece to add to that is managing your expectations. The idea that you're going to completely remove all the white mold like we think about when we spray a herbicide, that's just probably not a realistic expectation. Any guidance or, I guess, thoughts around these fungicide applications, whether it's, the R1, R3? We've had a couple guests on the podcast over the years that have talked about if you're only going to do once, try to hit, an R2. You've got Sean and some others talking about maybe a late fungicide application's better in terms of crop health, but that probably doesn't do us any good on white mold. What's your thoughts on this whole idea of using fungicides, and what should realistic expectations be on those?
Well, the R3, the kind of the fungicide stage that you use for the rest of the diseases and the plant health aspect, fungicides and beans, that's too late for white mold. Those infections are getting on those decaying flowers, and those flowers are out there a good 4 weeks before you get to that R3 stage. So you got to look at R1 and R2 and have that fungicide laying there when those spores are coming up from the little structures on the ground, getting in those decaying flowers. So R1, R2 seems to be seems to be a more proper timing for it. Even then, you're batting around trying to save 5 to maybe 10 bushel, depending on how severe the white mold's going to be. Really, in some of the heavier fields, we've went to just planting soybeans really late. If you have to plant beans in those fields, there's probably an aspect, and I think it's all due to rainfall. All of us want to plant beans early, but then when you plant early, it puts your beans out there in that reproductive stage with all that moisture for a long time. So planting late, it seems like you compress everything. It tends to dry up. So I think we just dodge it on the backside. So you give up a lot of that early planted yield, but it's way less than what we get with the terrible white mold infections that we have in some of these fields.
Okay. Well, Brian, last question here. I'm curious, as we mentioned, we're headed into the winter and here soon, and customer meetings and things. I'm curious, what's going to be one of the big topics that you visit with your growers about this winter as you kind of get around and do your meetings and things?
Unless things change, I think economics are probably going to dominate most conversations. Sure. Where can you pull the reins back a little bit and not hurt yourself on the yield side? So that we kind of saw a glimpse of that last spring, and that definitely hasn't died off. So I expect that to be at the forefront. When times are good, it's easy to spend money on little things here and there trying to improve yields. And now you flip the switch and you're kind of thinking, well, I can save a little bit here and there. How much am I going to be hurt? So I would expect that for me to dominate the conversation, because unlike what you guys had, tar spots, we're used to it. So that's not going to dominate our conversation. So I perceive that going forward to be probably the most asked about thing going on this winter in meetings.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think so. I'm starting to try to formulate that a little bit. One of the things that I think we'll probably use, and Ben, this may be a topic for a future podcast, is the Pioneer Yield Pyramid that I know a number of us have talked about before. Just this idea of what are the building blocks for a good crop, and based on my production level, what are the things I should be concerned about and be thinking about in terms of my management style. And I think that may be a way for us to be able to provide some level of this conversation that Brian's talking about, and how we do this and manage according to what our economics are going to be in 25. So Anything else that we need to cover today, Ben?
No, I think that's been great, and I think that the takeaway for me that I'd like growers, if you're new to tar spot this year, is to understand, and I don't think that this can be overstated, that if you had a train wreck this year with tar spot, Brian is from ground zero. I mean, it's as bad up there as it is anywhere, pretty much every year, and they don't have a mess every year right there. So the key is we're going to see it every year. And probably a normal year, if I had to guess, looking forward, is going to be that it comes in fairly late. We'll have some impact if we miss it on yield, some impact on standability, but it's not going to be some of the 100 bushel, honestly, Brian, 100 bushel yield swings that we saw this year.
Sure. And
some competitive products from Tar Spot. So it is here. We do have to deal with it. This was in some areas an abnormally heavy pressure year, and I don't think that we're going to see that every year going forward. But we do have the potential for it because it does overwinter here. But I don't think it's a Chicken Little situation. We can definitely manage it. I do believe the management starts with genetics, like I mentioned, but we'll just have to see what the weather brings us and how pressure comes, and hope that folks are a little bit more aware of it going forward, where we had a mess where we got snuck up on to some degree. So, but that's my big takeaway, is that it's not going to be like this every year. We're going to have to deal with it at some level, but probably not at this level every year.
I think that's well said. Brian, if somebody heard something today and they want to follow along with what's going on in your geography, I know you've got some social media places that you like to post and share some information. I certainly know that your Facebook page, you're fairly active there with some really good agronomic information. Where can folks go to follow along with what's going on in that geography you described to us a little earlier?
Yes, so I have access on 3 or 4 different social media posts. I am most active on Facebook probably, but at any of them you search for @bald_agronomist and you will find me.
All right, fair enough. Ben, if somebody wants to follow along with what's going on down south, how can they do that?
Yep, you can find me occasionally on X @TheBenJacob and on Facebook @BenJacobAgronomy. Brian, how about you?
Yep, you can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader. So with that, we appreciate Brian Early joining us today to talk a little bit about tar spot and white mold up north. And we'll start our rounds throughout the geography, visiting with our other colleagues about what they saw this year. If you like the podcast, please be sure to give it a thumbs up or a 4-star rating on your podcast platform of preference. We hope that this finds you very safe and you had a good fall. And so with that, we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.